Good afternoon, everybody, on today, this Earth Day. Glad to see everyone's faces and names come across this morning as we're getting ready for today's Lunch and Learn. I'm very excited. Today's Lunch and Learn was organized by Sarah Schlosser, Annie Jones, and Larry Jones. And the focus, as most of you are aware, is the potential effects of COVID-19 on nonprofit organizations. And we are very happy to welcome today Linda Ketcham, who is the Executive Director of Madison-area Urban Ministries, Tom Linfield, who's the Vice President of Community Impact for the Madison Community Foundation, and Bryce, who's the Associate Director of UW-Milwaukee's Helen Institute for Nonprofit Management. I'd like to thank them all for participating today and taking the time to join us. We're very honored to have you here. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah, who will be moderating today's session.
Great, thanks, Kristen, and thank you all for joining. I'm actually really excited. We saw that this Lunch and Learn series had a TBD, and I reached out to Kristen and said, hey, it might be really interesting for our colleagues to hear a little bit about what's happening in the nonprofit side of our communities. And so we did some brainstorming, Annie and Larry and Kristen and I thought about how we might begin to introduce this topic. And I will say, we feel like it could be its own series. There's so much we could cover. And what we decided to do was settle in on a few key pieces in this first conversation with the thought that we might expand the conversation after today to some other sessions. So when we talked about what our purpose here of today's Lunch and Learn is really to just get some insight in how we might contribute to building the capacity of the nonprofits and community-based organizations during this time of COVID-19. And we've asked our three panelists to join us, each with a very specific focus. So in a moment here, I'll kick it off and I'll have Bryce Lord kick it off. As Kristen mentioned, he's with the Helen Institute for Nonprofit Management. We've connected through a network that's quickly expanding that started with some connections I made with the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies here at UW-Madison. And so Bryce is going to talk a little bit about, he's going to tell you a little bit about the Institute so you know who they are and what they do. He's also going to share some findings from a 2019 study they did that looks at the size, scope, and economic impact of the nonprofit sector. Of course, knowing that that'll be shifting on us and already is. And so he'll also share a little bit about what he sees from some research they've already begun doing as impact across the nonprofit sector. Then we'll turn it over to Linda, and we've invited Linda Ketcham to join us because she runs a nonprofit, but specifically we were really interested in her sharing with us the impact from a social justice perspective, because that's a big aspect of what's going on out in our communities and something that our nonprofits are being faced with. And then Tom Linfield with the Madison Community Foundation is going to help us understand from the perspective of community foundations what they see as some of the impacts on both the nonprofits and the donors. So we'll give each of them some time to chat. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. We will reserve time at the end for all the panelists to also share what kinds of support they think they're seeing nonprofits needing, and for you all to chime in into the conversation. So with that, Bryce, I'm going to turn it over to you to share again a little bit about the Helen Institute, the report you did in 2019, and then what you're starting to see already shifting on us in the sector.
Sure, definitely. First of all, thank you for the invitation, both Sarah and Kristen. I appreciate being here. And I hope you guys all have a little bit better weather than we're having here in Milwaukee. It's overcast and chilly, so I'm glad to be sitting here at the dining table, I guess, than out walking the dog. So HBI, because it's so much easier to say than the Helen Bader Institute for Nonprofit Management at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, was founded about 20 years ago as the funders in southeastern Wisconsin began to realize that the nonprofit community here wasn't necessarily in a place to pick up with the government, able to pick up the pieces as the government was moving away from social service provision. And so our mission, after a big think tank that included nonprofit funders, public for-profit leaders, education. They came up with a 10-point plan, one of the points being an academic research center, which ended up being at UW-Milwaukee because we had a very energetic chancellor at the time, Nancy Zimpher. We are the remaining point in that plan that still holds true to its original form. A couple of them merged into another program, and the rest have all fallen off. So we've been around for a while, and our primary mission is focusing on 3 different areas: education, research, and community service. In terms of education, we have several graduate programs focusing on nonprofit management, and it was very specific that we were designed very specifically to focus on graduate education rather than undergraduate, as we look at sort of tying into the research aspect of the sector. And our faculty, both housed within the Institute and the Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration, look at a number of different aspects of nonprofit life. One of the hot topics right now are the leadership models in charter schools and how that affects as we use public funding in a nonprofit model. But then we also connect through our affiliate program faculty, not just at UWM, but all over the state. And that's kind of in a roundabout way how Sarah and I met, and that's how the WisEnergy, the Wisconsin Nonprofit Resources Group, developed as we started looking around the UW system. And that served us very well in a number of different ways. It helps expand our capacity, but also helps to kind of link a lot of the interest and the work that's being done in these fields in all different parts of the state. And then we also focus quite a lot on community support, and that's where I largely focus. We look at I kind of look at my role as being translating the academic research component to boots on the ground, kind of in the trenches, best practices, and seeing how we can make those. So it's not just ivory tower stuff that doesn't go anywhere, but a journal. We have over time developed a number of different community programs as well. We have an online jobs board. We hold leadership circles for a number. I think we have 5 different circles right now in the Milwaukee area. We have a summer film series. I mean, we try to look at all different ways to engage the community beyond the classroom while still using some of the ideas and training that our students would get, and get it out of that, more cloistered environment. Tied to that, we are in the process of developing an online training platform that will be available statewide. So we're, kind of constantly looking at ways to get out of southeastern Wisconsin. We are one of the only, we were the first academic center focusing on the nonprofit sector in the state, and there are several others now. We're very proud, I kind of forgot to, as we talk about graduate education, we're very proud that our Masters of Science in Nonprofit Management and Leadership last summer was recognized as one of now only 10 accredited programs in this field in the world. And it's here in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee of all places. So as we look at New York and competing with Arizona and London and all of these other places, we're right up there at the top. So I think that's very encouraging. So as Sarah mentioned, in 2019, we did a second edition of what we call our Nonprofit Wisconsin in Brief. In 2015, we released the first report looking at just the overall size and scope of the Wisconsin nonprofit sector. And with the idea that every couple of years we would go back to this and take another snapshot and get an idea of how things are trending, what's happening, so that we can start documenting those paths that are following up. And then we decided this time to start looking a little bit more actively at the economic impact of the sector and kind of what that means in terms of helping to promote it as a significant part of the Wisconsin workforce. In the brief, we have some challenges in that we're restricted to kind of where we pull data from, and in this case, we're looking specifically at IRS 990 forms that are kind of dug through and pulled out. So we are unable to really get a close look at those organizations now $50,000 in revenue and below, which are a significant piece of the puzzle that unfortunately, because of the tax filing laws, we can't really get anything. It's all voluntary on their part, and that doesn't really help. But in looking at that in the data that we can access and knowing this situation, you can make a lot of really solid assumptions and interpretations on that. We effectively looked at over 36,000 nonprofits in Wisconsin that have that revenue stream of 50,000 and above, knowing that there are probably 10 to 15,000 more that are less, or are simply considered charitable organizations without having filed for the full 501c3 status at this point. The majority of the organizations we looked at have revenue streams under 500,000 annually, meaning that, and we're talking like 72%. So the majority of nonprofits in Wisconsin are small staffed. This is probably a no-brainer to anybody that looks out and around, but it's still, I think, good to know to have that actual data, that it's not just your personal opinion or perspective, but it is factual. Keeping that in mind, when we started looking at the economic impact, we found that this is effectively one of the largest workforces in Wisconsin, with just under 12% of statewide employment being tied to the sector. Yeah, I think it was behind both, what do they call it, hotel and food services and real estate, basically meaning construction and all of that. And we're talking about $14.6 billion in wages every year. That's a pretty significant part of the Wisconsin economy. So what we hope to do in the future is we'll actually pull out the economic impact indicators on an annual basis and start tracking this a little bit more regularly, and pushing it out there as part of our attempt to advocate for the sector within the constraints of a state university. We have to keep that in mind all the time, but really looking at how that plays out. One of the things that we did discover, though, is that wages, generally speaking, are low in comparison, but what we found out in the last year is that for the first time ever, nonprofit wage increases over the past year surpassed for-profit wage increases. So that's kind of exciting. I mean, it's once, and that is to say that for-profit wages are still generally higher, and Wisconsin, as a rule, is about $1,000 under the national average of for nonprofit wages. But for the first time, we're actually seeing increases in sort of the standard wage. And so that's encouraging. And so we're going to keep watching and making sure that that trend continues. But I think what is also really exciting in the report is that we have one of the highest volunteerism rates in the nation. We have consistently ranked third highest. This year, or in 2019, we actually dropped to fourth. I actually argue that because we lost the ability, there was a shift in the tax law that we lost the ability, how am I going to say this? The constraint that we saw before in the 50,000 limit used to be 25. So we used to be able to get all the way down to $25,000 in income and watch them, but the tax law has changed, so now it's $50,000 threshold. I argue that with the loss of being able to track those organizations between $25,000 and $50,000, we also lost the ability to track their volunteerism numbers, which is why we dropped from third to fourth. But so I still think personally, we're still third. I'm not going to let that go. But we are consistently among one of the highest ranking in terms of volunteers in the country. I think that translates to the fact that Wisconsinites like to give of themselves and not of their checkbooks personally, but I think that's okay because it gets a lot of the work done. And that's kind of a basic landscape of what the sector looks like right now. Not a lot of it was surprising, perhaps, but like I say again, it's really good to see that things are, for the most part, trending with the national averages, and that we do stand out in some ways, but we also don't fall behind in most of them. So I think that's encouraging. And we'll continue taking this look for a while, and like I say, we'll look for the economic impact stuff a little bit more frequently, because I think there's some very, very good things to promote. So in terms of the ongoing pandemic, this last fall, we conducted, in partnership with a nonprofit in Milwaukee, an assessment of nonprofit needs. We recently lost a lot of resource organizations here in southeastern Wisconsin, and funders were really anxious to see how nonprofits were surviving and getting along without those access to training and access to support. So we conducted a survey specifically looking at Milwaukee County, and it was always HBI's intention that once that was over, we wanted to take the survey more statewide and get a better picture of the nonprofit resource landscape. And then we realized that we aren't in a normal situation anymore. And so that whole overall project got put on hold, and we started to think, well, we still need to understand what this new normal is, even if it's just for a few months. The result is going to last for a while. It takes nonprofits a long time to get up and running, and when they have this kind of a significant challenge to face, it's going to take them a little while to get back on track. So what can we do to track that and potentially provide information and assistance to government funders, government leaders, funders, other nonprofit leaders, in order to help them get back to whatever that normal is going to be. And so we started a poll, a survey project that will last throughout the year. We are currently in the middle of our first survey period. This first survey closes at midnight next Wednesday, looking at the effect of the pandemic on nonprofit program and service delivery, funding, tied also to CARES Act stimulus funding access and effectiveness, and looking at payroll and staffing issues, which is certainly understandably a problem with a lot of the shelter in place order. I took a look, as I was mentioning earlier, I did take a look at our initial findings just to kind of get an idea of where things are going. We're having a very good response rate. Could be higher when you have to realize that in this kind of work, response rates tend to be low, just because people don't have the time or the interest to sit and take a survey. And right now, you're seeing a lot of surveys. We're not hardly the only one doing this. But all things considered, we're actually very excited that we have the responses we do after 1 week. The Milwaukee survey, which was much smaller, it took us months to get to a point that we have already surpassed with the state survey. So we're very excited about that. The majority of the respondents so far are in human services. We've had a great outpouring from the arts community, and largely because I think we've had some strong connections lately with like the Arts Board and the Arts, Wisconsin Arts Board and other arts organizations around the country, or the state. So again, the majority of the respondents are under 50,000 in revenue, which again is kind of reflective of the statewide community. So I think looks like we are getting a really good, effective cross-section of what the state sector looks like. So that's encouraging. We've also heard from 40 different counties so far, some sort of representation in response from 40 counties. Overall, I hesitate to say that there were no surprises, but you'll find that the majority of them are offering their services in a severely reduced capacity or have been forced to deliver them in a very different way, meaning that they are moving online or trying to figure out how to provide human services, for example, in a virtual setting. There's a lot of talk of telehealth options and how to communicate with their clients in a Zoom conference or online. And yet having the challenges that a lot of the service recipients may be technically challenged. They may be a senior community that don't necessarily have access or an understanding of the technology required. So I hesitate to say that that's too much of a surprise, but I think it's where things are probably headed for the next month or two at least. So I was a little surprised that regarding staffing and payroll, a lot of and which ties to funding, majority of the nonprofits that responded are going to be able to make payroll and staffing full, or at least a useful staffing level through the next 8 weeks, at least. I have heard a lot of stories just anecdotally about layoffs and furloughs and unemployment filings and PPE funding, but the majority of them at this point feel fairly comfortable for at least the next 2 months. Similarly, they feel comfortable that their services will at least be able to continue, even if it is in this sort of restricted format, that they'll actually, they're not necessarily all closing their doors. Now, we do have, I would say, 20 to 30% of them that are looking at shuttering within the immediate future. So that's something to definitely take into consideration as we kind of look at how this all takes away. There's a lot of, in our survey, there are a couple of different options for people to provide open-ended, anecdotal, text responses, and we haven't quite filtered through that yet, but taking a quick look, I mean, it just bolsters a lot of what we're seeing in the numbers. I would say one thing that I found quite interesting, because we did specifically ask, what kind of help do you need? What kind of assistance can funders or governments or academic partners actually look to help provide you? And a lot of it, again, not a big surprise. Number one was reevaluating the fundraising strategy. It's always, from our perspective anyway, going to boil down to fundraising first. But then it turned to, interestingly, getting their message out in an effective way and sharing information about their needs with funders and government officials and corporate leaders. Historically, nonprofits in Wisconsin don't participate in advocacy work because there's a mix-up. I personally think a mix-up in what advocacy means. It's not just public policy work, it's also public education. And as a rule, nonprofits in Wisconsin, advocacy in general is a 4-letter word, and so we avoid it completely because we're not allowed to do that, forgetting that they can do public education in that area. And so they don't engage in that very much. But it is interesting that both in the Milwaukee assessment we did and in this one, what's coming to light is the challenges they're facing in getting their message out, in educating the public in what they do and in what they need and the challenges they face. So that again, it's a trend that we see pretty consistently here, and that we are constantly trying to figure out how to help with, while avoiding the horrors of public policy work in the sector. But I think, go ahead.
I'm gonna jump in because
I know I'm going on and on and on. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
well, and it's all really good.
Give me a format and I'm off. So
yeah, no, that's good. I think you're giving a lot. I mean, it was good to hear the background in the previous report, and then what you're already starting to see. And I'm hearing some themes that you're mentioning that I really think that we can, Linda and Tom will be able to, from where they sit in the nonprofit sector, build on. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna
please do.
pass it over, and then we'll make sure that we've got time for all those thoughts to connect together. So I'm going to invite Linda to speak to us next. And again, she's the executive director of the Madison-area Urban Ministry. We were looking for someone who could represent the voice of what's a nonprofit that's going through this time, but also one that has an eye on that social justice perspective. And Bryce, I heard some of those themes popping up in the things you were talking about who's being, most impacted, and even the getting the message out piece. So with that, Linda, I'd love to invite you to share with us, tell us a little bit about MUM, for those who don't know what the organization is and does, and then if you could just help us understand the impact of COVID-19 from that social justice perspective.
Sure, thank you, Sarah. So at Madison-area Urban Ministry, we work primarily with individuals who are returning to the community from prison or jail. We work with children who have an incarcerated parent. We also have a 24/7 medical recuperative shelter for homeless families who have a member being discharged from the hospital, and a vocational training program that teaches commercial baking called Just Bakery. We were started as an agency back in 1971 with a focus in part on advocacy. So we're one of those maybe rare nonprofits that continues to engage in public advocacy on issues. And we were really focused as an organization on issues related to racism, economic justice, fair and affordable housing, access to education. And for us in the 1990s, where all of those issues converged, was with our prison system and our criminal justice system, and who we sent to prison and what happened to people when they came home from prison. So that's kind of the framework from which we see what's happening right now and the work that we're doing. So with homeless families, with individuals that our prison system is still releasing people from prison, our jails are still releasing people from prison. And it's this weird situation where we don't want people incarcerated in what can easily become a hotspot for COVID infection. And yet people, by and large, are being released into homelessness to enter a shelter system where, again, it can be a hotbed of COVID transmission. And so it's this very difficult place to be in terms of working with people. One of the things that we see in terms of advocacy, there's not enough housing. So what we're seeing with our participants, many of whom have been over the last couple of years with the current economy, we're very successful in helping people find employment. But very much like a canary in the coal mine, our participants are the people who are being laid off first, oftentimes. And so we are seeing them now, if they had housing with housing instability. The stimulus package that was passed had some restrictions about who could get funding, who's going to get that $1,200. The men and women and the children that we're working with in our programs disproportionately are people of color, which is true across life domains. So it's true in our Healing House program, it's true in our Just Bakery program that works with people with significant barriers to employment. If you have back child support, you will not get your $1,200. If you are married and have back child support, your spouse also will not get their $1,200. So families who are already very vulnerable economically, who have arrears that they're paying through payroll deduction, are not going to get $2,400 or $2,900. So if they have children, the children are also negatively impacted because that benefit to the children also doesn't come to that family. If you didn't file a tax return in 2018 or 19, well, depending on when you were released from incarceration, you may or may not have filed a tax return. So you're not going to get those funds. So we're even seeing in terms of some of the stimulus assistance that's been put out there, again, our program participants are not going to be eligible or able to access those funds. And that includes many of our own staff, because we're an agency that's committed to hiring people with lived experience with incarceration. And so even our own staff are not benefiting from some of those stimulus packages. It is true, we've had to, the nonprofit sector, we've had to think fast, and it's been a challenge to, in terms of technology. For example, I'm talking to you from home because my personal laptop has a camera. Our equipment through MOM is not, we haven't been able to upgrade our own technology as an agency wide to have computers that have cameras built in, or to get the cameras. So even with having our staff work remotely, as we've shifted gears, we've had some technology issues, both for our program participants, but also just within our own capacity as an organization. So that's been a bit of a challenge. We are working remotely, as I said, in some of our programs. Obviously, Healing Houses as a medical respite is up and running, and we have families there now. It's been a challenge to work with families to help them understand the safer at home, shelter in place, and why we've put additional restrictions on them leaving the facility and coming back in, because every family has at least one member who's medically vulnerable, who's been discharged from a hospital. So that's been a challenge, and that's been a challenge across shelters, I think statewide, homeless shelters, getting PPE. No masks, no goggles. Gloves are difficult to get. In fact, for our Healing House, the only reason we have gloves at Healing House right now is because we don't have students in our Just Bakery commercial kitchen, and we normally have cases of gloves there because our students are using gloves in the kitchen. So we've been able to ship our gloves from Just Bakery over to Healing House, but getting masks, those kinds of things have been challenges for the nonprofit sector if you're not considered a medical provider. So those are some of the challenges. Again, the racial disparities that we see are across the lines. I'm just thinking in terms of some of the other things that we're seeing. So we're working with a lot of folks remotely, checking in by phone every other day with our reentry staff, except that we do have participants who are really in crisis. And so we are seeing some people face-to-face right now. Just Bakery, we shifted. It took us about 4 weeks, but we're now doing all of the classroom portion of our program is online. We loaned out all of our agency Chromebooks to our students so that they could have access to the online platform and continue their training in the program. We're going to hit a bump, though, when they get to the point where they're supposed to be in the training kitchen, because we can't have them in the training kitchen right now. So that's going to postpone their ability to complete that program. The stress that we're seeing in our program participants as their housing becomes more unstable, as their income is reduced, we're seeing an increase in relapse for people with addiction. We're seeing an increase in stress-related illness, and much of it's not related to COVID. 2 weeks ago in our homeless community, we had 3 people die over the course of one weekend. 2 were an overdose, and 1 was a heart attack. And these were all individuals in their 40s and 50s, not people that you would normally, in particular when we're talking heart attack. Within MOM, we've had 3 of our program participants since the end of February die. 1 likely COVID related, 1 was a heart attack, and 1 was an overdose. These are the things that we're gonna, I think, see increasingly as people are feeling more isolated, as people can't access services. That's why it's so challenging for people coming out of jail and prison or other treatment programs. And so many businesses are not seeing people face-to-face, their doors aren't open. And some of our participants, we've shifted some of our direct service support from bus tickets, because nobody wants to ride the bus right now, to minutes for your phone so that people can stay connected. So our funders have been very flexible with us and letting us shift some money around in how we normally do direct support or assistance. But these are the kinds of things, and some of our program participants, depending on the nature of their offense, aren't allowed to have an iPhone. They can have a flip phone, but they are not allowed to have internet access, which is further impeding their ability to feel or connect with resources in the community. And so there are a lot of different things, but that isolation is really, has really been challenging. And it's been challenging even for our own staff to be able to grieve our participants who have lost. And I know that this is happening around the state in the nonprofit sector. We have colleagues who are grieving the loss, the death of participants because of COVID, because of other stress-related illness. And for us, especially the incarceration really takes a toll on your body. The other challenge we've seen is it's this weird, so we have an administration that has been paroling people who have been eligible for parole for 8 years and weren't getting out because of previous administration's resistance to letting people out on parole. We're now seeing over the last year and a half, many people being paroled after years, 36, in one case, 36 years of incarceration. They're coming out as senior citizens. There is no senior reentry housing. They have medical issues, but depending on the nature of their offense, they can't get into rehab facilities or nursing homes. And so there's all these other issues that are always there that are now being exacerbated because of COVID-19. And so I think these are just some of the challenges that we see, and across every one of those areas are the racial disparities that we see in our state, as well as the economic disparities that we've seen, as was mentioned. Nonprofits struggle as well in keeping and paying employees livable wages. And you're right, there's been an increase for some, but again, I think I know one of the questions later is what can nonprofits be doing? And I think for the nonprofit sector, we would be remiss to not engage actively in advocacy, because COVID-19, for anyone who didn't see it before, this pandemic has laid bare all of the really ugly racism, economic injustice, whether it's access to healthcare, whether it's housing, employment, any of those, it's all out there now. And we can see it in the mortality rates. We see it across the board. So if we don't, as a nonprofit sector that has $14.6 billion in payroll, if we don't mobilize ourselves across this state to start pushing for access to healthcare, for truly affordable housing, for an increase to the minimum wage, then we've done a disservice to every participant in every one of our programs. So I'm going to stop talking. So because I'm going to get really mad. Start cussing.
Well, Linda, we appreciate your passion and your time, because just as you speak about what your organization is doing, taking an hour away from all of that to be with us, we greatly appreciate that. And you've hit on some themes that I know many of the colleagues in this space are already looking at: livable wages, housing, workforce development. So you're hitting on themes that speak to a lot of the spaces we're working in. I think we really definitely, when Larry and Annie and Krista and I talked about this, we wanted to elevate and bring some voice to what you did, which is this, you said it laid bare the racial and economic injustices. Is what COVID-19 has done, and what's the role as we move forward to really make sure that those things are addressed, that they just don't fall back under the surface again. So thank you, Linda. With that, I'm going to turn to Tom Linfield, who is the Vice President of Community Impact with the Madison Community Foundation. He's going to tell us a little bit about the Madison Community Foundation, and then give us some perspective from one community foundation. I know you're well networked, so you can probably share a little bit about what you're hearing around the state on the impact on nonprofits and donors. So with that, take it away, Tom.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me on what's possibly the most depressing panel I've ever served on. I hope everybody is staying somewhat sane and healthy through all of this. I'm at home with 2 teenagers who are going out of their minds, and 3 cats who could not be happier that 4 people are petting them 24 hours a day. I work for the Madison Community Foundation. We're about 75 years old. We're one of about 1,300 community foundations across the country. We are relatively healthy. We have good reserves, and we have a large endowment. We hold about 1,100 funds, most of those endowment funds, and almost half of those funds are nonprofit endowment funds. So the good news is the first thing we were able to do when everything shut down in March is we were able to send out $4 million of endowment funding to nonprofit agencies in Dane County. The bad news is that that's just not enough money. I coordinate our grant making program. So overall, the Community Foundation last year distributed about $19 million. About $3 million of that was grant making, a lot of it unrestricted grant making, and that's the part I coordinate. Because we have such a strong United Way in Dane County, we have been working with them and promoting their fund. And they do, of course, all of their funding is for social services. So they're well situated. We've been publicizing that. I just sat on a panel with them to help distribute $1.5 million, which again sounds wonderful. It went to 36 agencies, and over 100 agencies had applied. So again, the need for money at every level, not just for the agency level, but for everybody who works at the agency or served by the agency, it's been exponential. But social services represent about maybe 400,000 of the 3 million in grant making. We focus a lot of our money on learning and education, K through 12 education, environmental stewardship and conservation, arts, community development, things like public libraries, bike trails, parks, public community arenas. And then we do a lot of nonprofit capacity building. And so one of the things we've also done is set up a second fund that's really for arts, learning, and environment. We're not out there fundraising for it because we don't want to compete with the United Way fund right now, but that is a place where donors who care about the non-kind of social service opportunities can give their money, and I'm hoping that will grow. It's small right now. We've talked to probably about 250 or more agencies in the last month, one-on-one, checking in on how they're doing. We have 230 different nonprofit agencies who are agency fund holders, and then we probably have another 100 more who are current grantees. So we've been reaching out in every sector, asking how are people doing, have they furloughed people, are they open, how many months of reserve funds do they have, etc. So really trying to get a sense. My overall take, this is nothing new, but we have an incredibly fragile nonprofit ecosystem. I keep using that expression all the time, fragile ecosystem, because in Dane County, and most of our money, all of our grant money stays in Dane County. Of the 19 million that went out, about 60% stays in Dane County, and the other 40% goes around the state and nation and worldwide, wherever individuals want to distribute. But we have 3,000 501c3 public charities in Dane County. And for a long time, we've been very worried that there were so many. I often say I wish we had half as many that were twice as strong. Not because I want less work to be done, but because my fear is always, can they be as impactful as they want to be by all working separately? And about, I think 99.5% of all 501c3 applications are approved by the IRS these days. So it's very, very easy in this climate. We've seen 700 new nonprofits start in just the last 3 years. So every couple of days, somebody in Dane County is starting, not just in Dane County, every couple of days, somebody is starting their own nonprofit. I've had discussions in the last 2 days with 2 organizations that are thinking of starting nonprofits in this climate. While we did not, during the Great Recession, see nonprofits go out of business, we were a little surprised by that. We saw many of them weakened, and we do like to fund mergers. So we did fund some mergers coming out of that climate. The answer to the Great Recession was, please go out and spend money, buy a ticket, go to a show, be together. And this is the exact opposite. So I am very fearful that some of the nonprofits that we work with will not survive this, especially if, right now I think the optimistic thinking is, 2 or 3 months of this chaos, then we'll all go back to work and slowly things will start to get better. But what we're really hearing from people is We don't even know how to budget for next year. We don't know how to plan for next year. We're hearing this may come in waves. We may get another shutdown and another shutdown. The stimulus money disappeared about as fast as it came out, so hopefully there will be more. We are working to serve the field. So rather than going agency by agency, as some other funders have been doing, we tried to get a lot of stimulus money into the county. So we have put on, we've contracted with Scholl's Nonprofit Law, and they've put on some great webinars on how to apply for the money. And then we also funded them to do small group work and even one-on-one work with agencies, because we wanted to go beyond education and get them across the finish line, like get your application in ASAP. So the speed at which this all has to be done has been amazing. And so the good news is that we think we've helped leverage millions and millions of dollars of the PPP money and the EIDL money. The bad news is some of them are in limbo, they never heard back. And anyone working with a local bank seems to have a good story, and anyone working with a national bank has a devastating story. So the national banks focused on the for-profit community. One bank for the first 10 days wouldn't even work with nonprofits. Utterly shameful. And so, you know, I have people saying, great news, we just got $350,000. All those people we furloughed are coming back to work. And then another agency that is, you know, they want me to walk a check for a small amount over to them because they're so worried about going out of business. I've been surprised at how few of the agencies seem to have reserve funds. It's something we talk about a lot before you're even building an endowment. So I think a lot of the agencies living month to month. So some of them are like, it's great, we got 3 months, we got 6 months. I talked to one agency yesterday that has 2 years of reserves. But others, one agency had 3 months of reserves, but they spent 2 months of it on their capital campaign last year. So they've cut their entire staff, including their executive director, down to 1/3 time. Another agency is closed completely until August 15th. Closed completely. I don't even know if they're checking email. The arts agencies are particularly hard hit because they've had a triple whammy of performances canceled, their classrooms teaching canceled, and for many of the arts organizations, that's a huge part of their revenue is teaching, and then their fundraisers canceled. And this is true of very small agencies and very large ones. So it'll be interesting to see who weathers this the best. The small ones who they mostly volunteer, or they can live, they can make it, they've been doing it as volunteers, so they'll continue to do it. Or the large ones where they have major staff, major commitments, major sponsorships that they're now all returning. We also seen that the agencies, no matter what they're doing, are trying to help the individuals. So for instance, I spoke this morning with an agency that does art lessons for impoverished children, and they asked, could they take some of the grant money that we'd given them to buy grocery cards to give to the kids instead of art supplies. So we're also repurposing a lot of the current grants we've given. We're telling people, if Overture is shuttered and we gave you a grant to perform Overture, don't worry about it, repurpose it, do whatever your priority is, stay viable, pay your people if you can, do what you can. So I think that's very common. I think most foundations I've talked to have said, by all means, don't return any money, do what you can. We want you to exist once this is all over. I've had several agencies be very frank about the fact that even after 30 years of doing what they're doing, they don't know if they'll be around in a few months. I think the good news, if there is good news, it's that several agencies have been able to pivot really well, move to online learning, move to new ways of delivering their content. And at least 2 or 3 agencies have told me that they intended in the long run to do that, and this has forced them to do it in the short run. And so if there's a silver lining to any of this, I hope that whether it's art lessons or tutoring or literacy, that once this crisis passes, that they will be able to incorporate that kind of content delivery in along with what they regularly do. I think I'll end with the fact that we've been doing some research around our funding and impact in Dane County. And one of the things that I think will come out of this is that we really want to look at the financial health of the agencies in Dane County. We really want to get a better sense of how are they prepared should this happen again? Do they have reserve funds? Do they have disaster plans? Do they have an endowment? How close to the edge are they living? And what can we do to build that capacity? We already do a lot of nonprofit capacity building. We give grants in that area, but I've really gotten the sense that there needs to be a much better external needs assessment that I hope that, for nonprofits who want that, that we can maybe move forward on that, and then base some of our capacity building on how to really help people weather this kind of storm. And I'll end there.
Right. Thank you, Tom. It's really helpful. I know that many of the folks on the call are around the state, and so they might not be in spots where their community foundation is quite as robust and resourced as yours. However, I was hearing a number of themes that are still really important to be considering regardless. Things like looking at the, how you framed it, how close to the edge they are. Do they have disaster plans? Do they have reserve funding? I think those are all really important themes. I also, another theme I heard is mentioning with the arts and the impact in the arts. I know many of the folks on this call are in the community development space and working in placemaking. And so how is that going to affect the placemaking, the sense of place in our communities if those agencies struggle? So thank you to all of our panelists. I would like to, I had asked each of our panelists to also think about what kind of support nonprofits need. I heard that in your sharing. So rather than formally having you respond to that, I think maybe we'll just open up to questions. And if there's other things, Linda, Bryce, and Tom, you wanted to weave in about the support nonprofits need, please do that as you respond. So Kristen, do we just usually have folks just open up the mic and offer up questions or chat, or what's the preference?
We do. Everyone is able to unmute themselves. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. If you don't feel comfortable or your bandwidth is such right now that you can't voice the question yourself, then put it in the chat box and I'll ask your question on your behalf.
So I have a question for probably all three of you. I met this morning with a number of nonprofits in Brown County, and an issue that came up, it was a discussion on financing, is what happens. Right now there's a lot of funding available for, well, in some places at least, with foundations and others focusing on COVID-19 assistance. But then what happens then for regular programs, especially in 2 or 3 months when the fundraising activities that were supposed to happen now are canceled and they're not going to happen again. So what happens to the regular, if we looked at what happens with the regular activities that were being done before all this disaster situation happened?
I'll jump in. I think that 2020 is the beginning of this crisis, and the long tail goes at least through 2021. I think that, if an arts agency was doing a season of 4 shows, they'll be down to 2. If they were doing classes for 300 kids, they may be down to 100, or they may, cancel a season. We've seen that happen in the past too. So I think that, the realities are that you really either need to up your fundraising, and we have seen, I think, fundraising donations stay level or go up, largely in the basic needs area. But as stock markets go down, foundations lose their money, corporations lose their money, and individuals lose their giving power. I think this is going to have a really long tail, and I do not think 2021 will look anything like what people had planned programmatically.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I know we've had to cancel our one major fundraiser a year. We have 2 smaller ones that we usually have in the fall that we doubt will happen. And so we've just been more aggressively looking at other ways to kind of engage donors and increase support, and as well as looking at how we've been very fortunate, as I said, that funders have been very flexible in terms of how we're using some of our funds right now. And but it is going to be a long-term planning, and it is difficult because right now, for example, one of our federal grants, we're supposed to be putting the 2021 budget together for a federal grant and have that turned in by May 6th. We don't have a clue what that's really going to look like. So again, it's having conversations too, I think, with some of our funders and understanding that outcomes are going to look different. The numbers of people that can be served realistically are going to look different. And then we're going to have to look at, I mean, I think long-term, we do have to look at some of our staffing patterns. So for example, we have a position right now that's vacant that we've decided, as important as it is, we're keeping it vacant because we don't know. It's a discretionary in some ways position, and we're just keeping it vacant for now.
Yeah. I mean, I would throw out too that in the work that we're doing with this survey, it was never intended to be just a one quick snapshot. This is a year-long process at least that we're planning on continuing as long as we need to, and looking at kind of where the challenges continue to be, as we look at kind of how we can provide resources, knowing that, you know, as Tom said, 2020 is the year of COVID-19. The year of recovery could take several years to really get back there and to where operations are, as challenging as they may be, at least in a structure that we're used to. And so I don't know that there is an immediate answer, unfortunately, to how all of a sudden organizations are supposed to expect to fund themselves and recover. It's I think that is a question. I think it's a question for a panel. I would love to see a panel of funders tackle that, rather than the nonprofits. And I know there's one.
I'll add that I think
there's one happening next week. So.
And I will add that in a robust fundraising environment, you know, a nonprofit that has a really robust fundraising program, 80% of the money is coming from individuals, about 15% from foundations, 5% from corporations. So I think that the nonprofits that are going to survive this the best are the ones who come closer to that individual giving, because individuals have much more freedom and flexibility to support you, and those who love you will continue to support you. If you're a nonprofit that's highly reliant on foundation funds, be they local or federal, or corporate funds, like we saw after the recession, I think there's going to be a deep dive, a deep decline in that kind of funding. So what can agencies do? They can really keep fundraising. I've had a lot of nonprofits say, are we even allowed to fundraise in this climate? Absolutely. Keep getting your message out there. Keep telling people how essential and important what you do is. Keep trying to get your content and your storytelling out there, and really build up your fundraising, especially in an individual facility. There's still a very small percentage of people in America who donate money. There's a horrifyingly small percentage of multimillionaires who give money. There's a lot of money out there, and we need to get more people to be giving.
So I'm see the time, and Kristen has indicated that we certainly can go over. I think what I'll do is I'll do a little bit of a wrap up here, and then if our panelists are able to stay on for a few minutes and there are a few more questions, maybe we'll do it that way so that people can step off if they need to go somewhere else. But there are a few resources. We've got the study that Bryce was referencing that we'll share out. There's a good piece in Nonprofit Quarterly looking at some of the racial justice, social justice issues. So we'll be sending those resources out to you all. And I see that Deller had put a link in the chat connected to the flu recovery. And so maybe we'll grab that as well, because I'm not sure that it's always working to grab things out of the chat and copy and paste. I do want to thank Annie and Larry. So Annie Jones and Larry Jones, they helped to shape this. And we had, as I had mentioned at the start, we had had some conversations that we could go really long and really deep in a number of these spaces. And there were other things we mentioned that we didn't even bring to the table in today's panel. So we'll probably be in conversation with Kristen about if there's some other spots in this series that we might be able to bring some more of this conversation. And I want to thank Linda and Bryce and Tom for taking your time and sharing. It's been incredibly helpful to hear your perspectives. And with that, I'll say I'll formally end it. But again, if Linda and Bryce and Tom, if you can stay on a few more minutes, or anybody has some questions, we'll invite that. But if you have to go, we totally also respect that.
No, I'm happy to stick around for a little while. I'm not going anywhere.
I can stick around.
Have anything you needed to say to wrap up the session?
Not at all, but thank you so much. Linda, Bryce, Tom, Sarah, Annie, Larry, this has been wonderful. I'm going to end the recording for the next section of our questions and welcome those who have stayed on to let's have some conversation and see what we can do.